Good afternoon, and welcome to this installment of the GALEN Healthcare Solutions webcast series. Today's topic will focus on what to expect when migrating, breaking down the transition into phases so you're able to walk through what a typical clinical data migration would look like. I'd like to remind everyone that you are muted when you come into this webcast. You can use the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen to submit questions, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the presentation. All unanswered questions will be posted in Q&A format on our blog and wiki. To give a little background on our organization, GALEN Healthcare Solutions is a healthcare-focused services and solutions company. One of the key factors in our success is our company culture. Our expertise is both wide and deep, and our employees regularly make themselves available to each other in order to ensure the highest quality of services to our clients. For over a decade, GALEN has built a solid reputation of providing high-quality, expert-level IT consulting services to health systems, hospitals, and physician practices. We provide world-class professional and technical services to healthcare organizations that interoperate, aggregate, convert, harvest, and optimize clinical patient information within your multi-vendor system portfolio, including PM systems, your EMR, and also HIE. We deliver a suite of fully integrated products that enhance, automate, and simplify the access and use of clinical patient data within those systems to improve cost efficiency and quality outcomes. Your presenters today are Elise Brault and Jason King, who are both senior consultants on the data migration team here at GALEN. As part of the data migration team, their primary roles are defined as project manager and clinical analyst. The project manager role involves coordination between GALEN and the client resources, as well as keeping stakeholders up to speed about the project's progression and any decision points or changes to the project scope. The clinical analyst involves a more hands-on approach, mapping, training, and assisting with any needed build. With a combined 11 years of health IT experience, they have a lot of data migration expertise to share. Now here's Jason to start us off.
Thanks, Julie. So here's a quick overview of some of the topics we'll cover today for our webcast, What to Expect When Migrating, a walk through a clinical data migration. First, we'll briefly touch on what a clinical data migration is. Then we'll take a look at why healthcare organizations go through a clinical data migration. Next, we'll take a look at the team members at GALEN and the client who participate in the clinical data migration. And finally, we'll spend the majority of our time today looking at different phases of the clinical data migration process. Those phases being 1, project design, 2, extraction and data evaluation, 3, data mapping, 4, testing and validation, 5, the data migration go live, and finally 6, support and gap loads. So first off, what is a clinical data migration? Put simply, a clinical data migration is the process of extracting clinical data from one system and loading the data into another system. The system the data is extracted from is referred to as the source or the legacy system, and the system the data is loaded into is referred to as the target or the new system. Here we can also see that in order to accomplish a successful data migration, there are 3 components that are essential to its success. First, a proven process. Secondly, the right group of people. And third, a proven platform to move the migrated data from the legacy EMR to the target EMR. At GALEN, we've completed over 200 clinical data migrations, leveraging the knowledge of both our professional and technical services consultants to guide the process of a clinical data migration. We also leverage GALEN ETL to use as our platform to accurately and efficiently move data from the legacy EMR to the target EMR. Next, let's take a look at the why for why healthcare organizations go through a clinical data migration. Here are a few of the most common reasons why a migration happens. First, consolidation. A healthcare organization may be using multiple EMRs in the name of interoperability. They have chosen to consolidate to one EMR. Acquisitions. Migrations are needed when the healthcare organization acquires another, and the clinical data in different EMRs needs to be consolidated down into one system. And then finally, changing EMRs. Another reason for this is simply that healthcare organizations decided to change from one type of EMR to another, and the data from their legacy system needs to be brought over to the new EMR. Now let's take a look at the teams that are needed for a successful migration. The migration process takes a team of technical and subject matter experts, and the GALEN migration team is broken down in the following roles. The technical analyst extracts the data from the legacy system and formulates the data to be loaded into the target system. The clinical analyst is also the project manager for the migration. They do the mapping of each data element from the source system to the target system and participate in testing and validation of the clinical data. The technical analyst and clinical analyst work together to resolve issues that come up during the testing phases and communicate closely on all decisions made through the migration process. The analyst uses lessons learned from past migrations to recommend strategies and decisions to aid the client during the migration process. The following roles on the client side are essential to the success of the migration team. A team leader will help with any client-side coordination, such as identifying resources, providing contact information, obtaining sign-off, and providing scheduling information for competing projects and upgrades. Decision makers for all decisions that we made throughout the migration life cycle, things related to items like scope adjustment, timelines, mapping and validation, sign-off, and any other processes. Technical resources are needed to help with system access and are responsible for working with interfaces between systems. Clinical resources help with validating the clinical mapping done by the GALEN migration team and participate in testing and validation of migrated data. We recommend the clinical resources be familiar with data being mapped. For each example, For example, it's best to have lab orders validated by someone familiar with the client's lab compendium. Now let's take a look at the phases of a clinical data migration. As stated before, there are 6 phases. First, the project design. Second, extraction and data evaluation. Third, data mapping. 4, testing and validation. 5, data migration, go live. And 6, support and gap loads at the end of the project. For the remainder of the presentation, we'll be going through each phase in detail, looking at the action items and considerations for each. Also, you can see here we have a timeline for a migration that goes roughly for a year. You can see there is a 10-month period up to go live with an additional 2 months of support. You can also see that the phases are rather short. Some phases are rather short, such as data extraction and evaluation, as well as data mapping, while the testing and validation of the data is the longest phase. This is to help ensure we have a successful outcome. Also note that there are overlap of phases. It is typical to add additional mapping during the testing and validation stages of the migration because of build work that is completed, or to capture data that was added in the legacy EMR during the gap of the original data extractions. Okay, so now let's take a look at phase 1, which is the project design. Here are some actions that take place during this phase. The first item to be completed with any data migration is the project scope and contract. This defines the project timeline, both GALEN's and the client's responsibilities for the project's success, as well as data elements that will be in scope for the migration. The migration project officially begins when a kickoff meeting to review the details of the items in scope for the project. The reviewer provides the opportunity to ask questions and make clarifications to all parties so that they can sign off for the plan for the migration. The clinical analyst uses the refinement and clarification of the project scope to develop the project plan. It is also important to note that refinement to the scope can take place in later phases of the project if it is determined that a data element should be added or excluded after more data evaluation has occurred. The project plan itself will allow the project manager to put granularity around the migration project, assigning specific dates around tasks for the project, as well as assigning those tasks to different team members. The kickoff call is also a great time to make sure the process of providing access to the databases and systems for the migration team has started. These processes need to be started as soon as possible because it often takes longer than expected, and the actual migration work can only begin after system access has been granted. Here are some considerations during project design. The legacy system or systems being migrated house data in different ways. GALEN has migrated data from many different EMRs and has processes in place to help ensure data in scope make it into the target system accurately. The overall scope of the project is determined with the statement of work and when it is signed. However, here are a couple of examples of details that will need to be ironed out during the kickoff call. Patient demographics. Should deceased patients be migrated? Also, should test patients in the source system be migrated over to the target system? Secondly, encounters. Are all encounters in the source system going to be migrated, or are only encounters tied to clinical data that's in scope going to be migrated? The timeline for the migration needs to be considered as well. Depending upon which kind of EMR is the target system, there will be different testing requirements that impact the schedule. In addition, decisions made about the number of rounds of testing will affect the timeline. Some migrations that are more complex can take over a year, while others that are smaller in scope will take 4 to 5 months. The client has a migration team as described, but they will also bring in other resources during the migration that they will have to make plans for. For example, the last round of testing uses people that will actually be using the target system after the migration. The availability of these testers needs to be planned for at the beginning of the project to ensure their availability. And then finally, competing projects and planned upgrades also weigh heavily during the project design. They can have an effect on the availability of client resources, creating a need to update the project plan and adjust timelines. Upgrades to either the legacy or the target system can affect both how data is extracted and loaded. Knowing about these at the beginning of the project greatly reduces risk and helps to ensure the success of the migration. So now we'll move over to phase 2 of the migrations, extraction and data evaluation. In this phase, the technical analyst extracts the data in scope from the legacy and target systems so that every item can be mapped to an equivalent. The technical analyst creates mapping workbooks for each data element extracted. The extracted data will be analyzed and specific questions of scope or scoping details will be addressed. The technical analyst will use the mapping workbooks to configure the import files for the target system. During the data analysis, many decisions are made. For example, if an immunization requires an administration date in the target system, but is not required in the legacy system, a decision needs to be made to manage this discrepancy. For this situation, the GALEN migration team usually recommends that the immunization be loaded into the target system with a generic administration date that makes it obvious the date is not relevant, like 1/1 of 1900. The field is populated, but the end user will know that this is not a real administrative date. Codification insufficiencies can occur with various data elements such as allergy reactions. If the target system lacks an allergy reaction Rx norm code, it can potentially be added to assist with the current migration, as well as assisting with any other future migrations an organization takes on. If industry codification is missing from the legacy system, name-to-name matches can sometimes be used to map data. Another example concerns providers. If a provider is inactive in the source system, the question becomes whether or not to build the provider in the target system. Again, the client will decide, but we would recommend that one default provider in the target system be built and used for all inactive providers coming from the source system. A decision needs to be made on what note statuses to bring over as well from the source system to the target system. Usually, only signed and finalized notes are brought over, but a client may have a reason to make a different decision. Some data that's clinically important to the data in scope cannot be converted because it cannot be mapped to an equivalent data element in the target system. A decision needs to be made as to whether or not the data will be placed in a comment field of the data element in the target system, or if a document needs to be created to capture the information. Some examples we've encountered with this are annotations, pharmacy instructions, and other instances of free texted data within the legacy system. Okay, let's take a look at phase 3, data mapping. In order to migrate data from one EMR to another, the data will need to be matched up between systems. While we typically look to automate mapping as much as possible through industry standard codifications such as NDC, RxNorm, and SNOMED, each system may have its own individual codes and descriptions for the data elements. So in those cases, manual mapping will need to take place. Data mapping consists of mapping each legacy record for a given data element to a record in the target system. Once the technical analyst has completed extracting the legacy and source data and compiled the data into mapping workbooks, the clinical analyst will start mapping the data from one system to another. Usually, the clinical analyst will map one data element at a time. Once they have completed the first pass of mapping, they will work with the client to review the mappings and fix any issues. I have here listed the types of data that typical migrations would include. Besides mapping the major elements such as labs, vitals, and transcriptions, we also need to map the data that is associated with these major elements, such as departments and providers. And also, depending on the target system, there may also be a need to map descriptive data within the major data elements, such as statuses for notes and problems, allergy reactions for allergies, and routes and units for meds and immunizations. Okay, so there's a few items that need to be discussed before and during the mapping phase of the migration. These considerations will make the process more efficient and save time in the long run. As I said before, the clinical analyst will complete the initial mapping for each data element, but the client will also need to review and sign off on the mappings. Before getting to the mapping stage, it's important for the client to assign clinical resources or IT resources familiar with the data to validate and sign off on the mappings. These people tend to have really busy schedules, so the clinical analyst should schedule time to review the mappings with them prior to this phase. The clinical analyst should also be available to provide estimates on how long the review of mapping will take place. During the initial mapping and client review, people may find certain records or data elements that they don't want to convert to the target system. For example, I've had migrations where clients realized that medications weren't accurately being entered into the legacy EMR, so they decided not to convert them to the new EMR. I have also been involved in multiple migrations where certain scan types are used for miscellaneous and non-clinical scan documentation. The client made decisions not to migrate those since they weren't needed in the new system. Once the client has made the decision to exclude certain data elements or specific records, our technical analyst can easily remove these from the data being migrated. Mapping is probably one of the most consuming tasks within the migration. Some organizations may have thousands of results, medications, and problems that need to be mapped. One thing the clinical and technical analyst can help with is to find ways to automate these mappings. We can often use universal IDs or patterns within the data to help automate the mapping, such as using RxNorm codes for medications and allergies, or ICD-9 and 10 codes to help map problems. Sometimes, if hospitals or clinics use the same lab system, we can find patterns between the interface identities and EMR result codes. So I recommend taking the time to look at the data as a whole to find ways to automate the mapping, because this will ultimately save time for the entire project. Okay, so sometimes, however, even with automating some of the mappings, a client may also decide to limit the scope to reduce mapping times. Some target EMRs allow for us to import unmapped records and have the end users reconcile the data when they are in the patient's chart. If this is the case, we often recommend that we don't map anything under a certain number occurrences from the legacy system. This technique will usually save a lot of mapping time and will have a small impact on end users. For example, an example would be that we wouldn't map any problems, medications, or allergies that have less than 10 occurrences in the legacy system. Then we would only convert them to the target system, and the end users would reconcile the unmapped data to the new chart. Another possibility to limit mapping time is to use CCD, or the continuity of care document, to convert certain data types. A CCD is pretty much a patient summary report that can be shared between EMRs. Certain EMRs have the functionality to pull in specific data types from the CCD. So while seeing a patient, a provider or nurse can reconcile the CCD with the patient and pull in their data, usually problems, medications, and allergies, to the new EMR. The data mapping is either done behind the scenes with universal IDs, or the end user picks the correct match when reconciling the data to the patient's chart. Even with the ability to automate mapping and using other techniques to reduce mapping time, there will always be legacy data that we can't find matches for in the target system. This is when clinical analysts will work with the client to decide if new records should be set up in the target system. We find that this most commonly occurs with imaging and lab results. The client will need to make a decision to build equivalent matches, or maybe decide not to migrate certain records at all. If creating a new build for these items is the answer, the client should also make sure they have resources available to help build the new records. Okay, now I'm going to hand over the presentation to Elise so she can review the last 3 phases of the data migration.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. Phase 4 of the data migration is testing and validation. Once the mapping is complete and sign-off by the client's clinical resources has been obtained, final mapping updates are made to the master workbooks used by the GALEN technical resource and the GALEN ETL platform. The focus then shifts to loading data into the test environment and conducting multiple rounds of testing. And this is done to ensure that the migration data is complete, accurate, and also that user interaction with the data works as expected in the target environment. The number of testing rounds may vary by project, depending on things such as the length of the project timeline and how many testing environment refreshes are being planned. But in general, there are 4 different phases, each with its own distinctive purpose. Each testing round takes about 4 weeks, and this would include setup, coordination, the actual testing, and issues resolution. The first testing phase is unit testing. The unit test usually consists of generating and loading one message for each type of data being migrated. The objective here is to make sure that the import format of the incoming message is correct, and also that all the clinical content is displaying appropriately. It's not uncommon for the GALEN TS and client technical resource loading the data to conduct back and forth analysis and load multiple test messages before determining that each type of data is being generated correctly and also loaded successfully into the target environment. The next phase is small-scale testing. This effort usually consists of picking a sample population of between 5 and 20 patients and then migrating all of the in-scope data for these patients. Usually it's the GALEN clinical analyst who will be doing this validation, since the goal is to identify and correct any obvious flaws or issues with the data before getting the client testing resources involved in the effort. However, if the client does want to be involved in this round of testing, well, that certainly can be accommodated. The third phase of testing is large-scale. Large-scale testing typically includes converting one message for each record mapping within a data type. So, for example, if we mapped 50 immunization records from the legacy system to the target system, we would aim to convert one message for each of the 50 mapped immunizations. We also typically include a large sample population in this round of testing. Patients are chosen based on their chart size and content. In this way, we can maximize the amount of data that we have to test. In general, the more we can see in the first couple of rounds of testing, the better chances are of identifying the issues early and getting them fixed for subsequent rounds of testing. Large-scale testing involves clinical analysts as well as a core team of validation resources on the client side. This would usually include the clinical end users, physician champions, and or super users. The point is, it's very important to have people doing the validation who understand the data and have that clinical point of view. The last phase of testing is called full-scale testing. Depending on the target system and client preference, Full-scale testing may or may not be required for the migration, but we strongly recommend it for several reasons. During a full-scale test, all of the in-scope patients and clinical data are converted to the test environment. In an ideal situation, the testing environment is refreshed from the production environment just prior to loading the full-scale set of data. And in this way, the testing provides an opportunity to identify errors and issues likely to be encountered at go-live, and then allows the time to be able to address these issues before the actual go-live. It's kind of like a dress rehearsal. Some examples include maybe we identify missing patients and then follow up with the HIM team to ensure a plan is in place to get all the in-scope patients reconciled and loaded into the production environment. Another benefit is that we can test migration build, which should have been moved to the production environment before full-scale testing. So via the refresh, we can confirm that that build is present in the test environment. Sometimes the full-scale validation involves GALEN clinical analysts going on site at the client site in order to work side by side with end users to validate data and begin planning go-live strategies. And we do also usually recommend 2 rounds of full-scale testing, but this does require some effort and coordination with the client because since we are converting all patient data, we would then need the test environment to be cleared or wiped before loading the subsequent set. So sometimes it can be difficult to plan for multiple rounds of full-scale testing. So as far as considerations, the planning and preparation for testing is quite involved and will need to be discussed prior to this phase in the project with the client. One thing that needs to be identified early on in the project is which testing environment the project team will be working in. There will need to be a review around the client's current testing environment configuration. The main concern is to make sure that the testing environment closely reflects the production environment, because if the testing environment is out of sync with production significantly, then the testing that we do may not reflect what will actually happen in the production environment. So therefore, we usually recommend that the testing environment be refreshed very close to when the project team will begin work. And other things, for example, the environments would need to be in sync in terms of the software version and the like. So another item to discuss with the client is the plan for converting patients into the environment being used for testing. Sometimes an ADT interface may be set up. We often recommend pointing it at the testing environment to convert the patients. Or if the patients are already in production, then they can be brought over to the test environment via a refresh, as we've been discussing. Or maybe just directly loaded from the legacy environment. Whatever the approach, a reliable plan to load patients and keep them updated in the test environment has to be worked out prior to forging and loading clinical data. Another important consideration is that very often clients will have multiple projects occurring simultaneously, and it will be important to know what, if any, other project work is being done in the testing environment. In many cases, a timeline will need to be collaborated upon to make sure that we are not interfering with other project teams' work and vice versa, that our data migration work won't be compromised by other project teams using the environment. So along with the resources needed to configure the testing environment, the client is also going to need to schedule resources to do the actual validation, and the sooner these folks can be identified, the better. We suggest, especially with larger full-scale testing, that end users, or at least clinical users, be included in the validation. Overall, it's just important, once again, to include people who are familiar with the data and also workflows in the target system. It can be very complicated. Sometimes maybe designating a testing coordinator on top of the clinical analyst, assistance there to coordinate the testing phase of the migration can be very helpful. So just a few best practice items that I would like to go over with regard to full-scale testing. To start with, we recommend that when validating, testers have access to both the legacy and target systems so they can actually compare the data in each application against each other. Each tester will need to have logins, therefore, and they will need to have a computer setup where they can have simultaneous connections to both systems, and ideally, they will have dual monitor displays. Sometimes it works well to team up testers. One can be looking at data in one environment while the other is in the second environment and calling out validation together. That kind of thing can work well. Scheduling time for the testers to validate can take a lot of prep. As mentioned before, resources and users have limited time, usually away from their regular jobs. So if end users are involved, it may mean finding coverage for them, and that needs to be coordinated. And also the location. Sometimes it can be difficult to coordinate where to put testers. We recommend that testers not be at their personal desks so they're not distracted while doing testing. So sometimes setting up a temporary area or repurposing a training room or conference room to do the testing in can be a good idea. After the testing is complete, the issues will need to be consolidated and reviewed. Prior to testing, it should be decided how the testers will record issues during validation. We can provide clients with paper scripts, for example, so as testers are going through, they can jot down issues that they're seeing. The process should be worked out ahead of time with the client with a special attention on how and who will be doing the retesting and also the sign-off. The fifth phase of GALEN's methodology is migration go-live. The planning is the driving force in this phase. A very important part of the planning is determining the approach for loading data and whether gap loads will need to be planned for after any initial loads of data into the production environment are completed. So I just want to start off by saying that the way that we are presenting this information to you outlined in phases like this would suggest that each phase concludes before the next one begins, and that's certainly a true statement for many aspects of the projects where we have tasks, one project task dependent on the successful conclusion of another. But for go-live planning, it's not really a distinct phase. The go-live planning can start much earlier in the project timeline. Really, you could say even at the onset of the project, because as soon as the data migration begins with the client team, then the tracking of issues and decisions that will impact the go-live begin collecting as well. But going along the idea of the migration go-live phase as a distinctive sequential phase, then at a high level here, one of the deliverables we are looking for is the creation of a detailed checklist. This checklist will basically serve as the guidebook for outlining and tracking everything related to the migration that must be done as either a prerequisite for the go-live to kick off, or be done as during the actual migration or follow-up to the actual go-live event. On the technical side, the GALEN IT resource will be using the feedback and issues reported from testing to refine and tweak the import files for the client's live environment. Next, the plan for communication during migration weekend will be worked out. I shouldn't say weekend. Sometimes it's, migrations can be done any time of the week. Very often we do migrations over a weekend. Often this communication plan will be embedded right into the go-live checklist. And then finally, as part of the planning and review, a specific timeline for go-live activities will be vetted out and documented, again, usually right within the checklist. Some of the things to consider while planning for go-live include information gathering and tracking any decisions that are made by the conversion team leading up to the conversion weekend. Some of these particulars would have been framed up in the SOW or statement of work and reviewed as part of the kickoff. An example of this would be if the SOW stated that only verified results would be included in the migration, and if that's the case, then there will need to be a go-live action item to track, making sure that providers verify all of their outstanding results before the source system is decommissioned. Or at a minimum, the client would want to discuss an alternate plan with their lab vendor. Either way, the issue needs to be tracked and discussed as part of go-live planning. Sometimes during data mapping, peculiarities with data from the source system are uncovered, and these items are usually brought forth in the weekly status calls, and then any decisions made by the conversion team or migration team over how to convert the data, these decisions will need to be tracked and have the potential for making a significant impact on go-live. For example, in one of the data migrations I worked on, we uncovered a theme where there were many free text entries for all types of clinical data in the legacy system. Each data element had a unique code and description. It was very difficult to map over these discrete entries into the target system. So part of the solution led to technical work in the form of creating a GALEN conversion summary document that would capture certain result data and then would display as a scanned document in the patient's chart. This then uncovered the need to support staff and end users on the conversion data specifically, making sure that they knew where they would be seeing the chart summary and what kind of data they would be seeing in that document. So another very important way in which issues are raised and tracked is through testing. Many issues uncovered have the potential to impact planning for go-live and the training leading up to that. For example, we determined that smoking status and family history problem entries in the legacy EHR could not be mapped over to MU-compliant first-degree family history and the correlating smoking statuses in the target environment. So one of the training issues that came out of that was to make sure that the client included in their training a portion to for pre-appointment chart review, transition any conversion smoking statuses to the MU compliant entries, and then also make sure that the family history was documented with the first degree relative correlation. So as far as training materials, we've talked a little bit about the need to train support staff and end users on the migration data, and sometimes this aspect of the conversion can be easy to overlook because the focus is usually pretty intensely on getting the data in and not necessarily training the people that are going to be doing the reconciliation or the abstraction or, basically using the data going forward. So typically it's the client who pulls the training plan together and executes the training, but GALEN has experienced resources who can assist with this as well. At a minimum, making the migration documents, the decision document, mapping workbooks, the issues list available in a central place, such as a folder on the server that we're using for migration activities, or maybe a shared drive. This is a good idea, so everyone knows where to access the documents and be able to use them for reference. Timing of test of import files. When migrating data into the test environment, the GALEN team can time how long the messages take to generate and then how long it will take to load them, especially for larger sets of clinical data, such as results and scanned documents. This is very important information to have, and it definitely will drive the data migration timeline. So discussion with the client about how they plan to assimilate the migration data into their target environment is important. If, for example, the data will require some reconciliation once loaded, then perhaps the client would like to consider having the data loaded in advance of the go live, giving some kind of lead time for that work to take place. As part of go live planning, it may be important to bring in vendor representation as well to work out some things such as cutover plans, for example, with the results. So some questions to ask would be, when will the last round of results be pushed to the legacy EHR? And will the timing allow for any subsequent results verification to be done? Another very important question that drives the go-live planning is when will the end users be off the legacy EHR application? When will the last work be finished, essentially? So things of that nature are very important. Dependencies, it's always important to keep an eye on those tasks that must be completed within a certain time frame before another task can be completed. On a big note, I guess, import files must be created before they can be, the migration can be done, of course, but there are also lots of small examples to keep track of, such as the results verification that we talked about. Another example might be finishing up tasks in a particular environment. Reminders are sometimes items that need attention before the go live. So just to reiterate from the beginning of the project, PM will collect and keep track of all these open issues. And basically, from week to week, keep track of things that need to get done. And then in the go-live planning, we would review this data, bring it up for go-live consideration. Another way to collect the information is to review team emails and exchanges and pick out the issues and discussion items that are raised outside of the organized calls. Let me show you now an example of a go-live checklist. And here we go, the start of it. This is a sample in a pretty basic format. Not trying to create a big, complicated document to follow, but we do want to capture a pretty specific level of detail so everyone knows what's supposed to happen and also the dependencies like we've talked about. So notice the second item down here on the list is complete gap mappings. We'll be covering gap mapping and testing in a little bit when I go over phase 6. But basically this checklist illustrates, one way in which gap mapping can be addressed, and there are many different ways we can approach this. So in this example here, the client wanted to try to complete as much work as possible before their migration go weekend. So they wanted to take care of identifying any gap mappings that need to be done early on and shift that burden of work off of the go live weekend. Another thing I want to point out here is the importance of communication, and you can see a couple entries here. It's very important to plan communication and then also the unplanned communication, just making sure that we're staying on top of keeping people informed of what's happening. Even though multiple rounds of testing have been done in the test environment, the recently refreshed from production environment and later rounds, the recommendation is still to include a small set of validation in production with the go live data before loading the full scale load. How many patients the client wants to validate is negotiable. Whatever needs to be done for achieving a comfort level. Begin and end of day status emails and calls are a great way to keep the team informed of what's going on throughout the migration go live as well. And then usually, down here I have a status call. Usually after go live, we have another status call, maybe even the week after. Again, that really does depend on what's being planned for gap loads. Sometimes we're loading data into a patient's client's environment, up to a month after the actual go live. So phase 6. Support and gap loads, as far as the actions here. Go live support may be specified as part of the client statement of work, or it may be negotiated separately as the project moves along. GALEN team does have go live resources available to help out with the actual migration go live. And then issue resolution. So post migration, even though testing has been very thorough and so on, from time to time we do encounter issues that crop up that need to be resolved. So further discussion about each issue and whether or not to fix is to be included as within the scope of the project or as a separate addendum, then takes place. So it's very common for issue resolution to take place over a week or two after the migration. So I'll just talk about what gap mapping means. And the gist of it is that with all the data migrations, the team basically is working through the project from an extract taken near or at some point, during the project timeline, usually from the production database, from the legacy EHR. And then one of the things to consider as part of go live planning is how to account for the new or changed data that is taking place or being entered into the legacy application from the time of the extract that was taken to the time of go live. And so there are lots of possible approaches here. We already talked about the client who wanted to take care of some of the gap mapping before the migration go live in the earlier slide there. Another client might decide to go into the go live with data from the original extract, and then as part of the migration activities, the gap data would be basically dealt with at go live. That can be done. Sometimes we do gap loads after go live. So essentially the gap analysis that can take place post-migration go live also. At least one big consideration when working out the plan for gap loading of data is how accessible is the data to the technical migration team. So for example, in one of the migration projects I've worked in, there is a tertiary vendor involved with providing the data extract. So therefore, we have a limitation there that we need to work with. And sometimes there is a cost associated to getting a copy of the data, and the client typically will have to absorb that fee. So sometimes, how the data is hosted and who is controlling the exports can be a big factor as far as planning gap loads. At the conclusion of the project, it's important to update and then store, once again, the project documentation in a location where the client team can easily access the information. These documents include, and may not be limited to, the scope or decision list, issues list, final mapping workbooks, along with any lessons learned documented for the benefit of future project teams. The client support staff who will be supporting end users long after the GALEN team has finished the project and post-go-live support will need to know where to find the documents and how to interpret them. So a strong finish to the migration is essential, and it's important to tie up those loose ends. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Julie so she can review some of the tools and features of GALEN Healthcare Solutions data migration and archival services.
Thanks, Elise. GALEN offers a full suite of data migration services. Our experts are here to help with all aspects of the conversion process, from extracting data from the legacy system to cross-referencing and mapping from one nomenclature to another to loading safely into the target system while keeping desired workflows and functionality intact. Based on decades of experience, GALEN has developed an industry-leading automated conversion platform called GALEN ETL. It features an extensible plugin-based architecture, proven libraries, and nearly limitless scalability. We support multiple standards, nomenclature, and technology, allowing us to tackle nearly any conversion. We believe that no source system is too complex or too large. You can learn more by visiting the Knowledge Center on our website, where you can read our white papers analyzing top industry subject matter, read some of our success stories, and view one of our 200-plus webinars, which are also available on our YouTube channel. We also have over 650 articles written on our blog, which we update weekly to keep to keep up with the constant happenings in healthcare IT. Check it all out on our website, galenhealthcare.com, and experience the difference with Galen. If you are interested in hearing more about any of our services, please feel free to email us or visit our website and wiki for more information. At this time, please submit any questions you have, and I'm going to hand the controls back over to Elise and Jason to answer them.
Thanks, Julie. So we can take a few questions today. I did want to remind everybody, if we are not able to get to your question specifically, we will answer those and then post those via our wiki at galenhealthcare.com. So Elise, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this first one here. It says, how can I identify my data in the new EMR?
Yeah, I can take that one, Jason, to start, and then you can fill in whatever additional you want to. We can make several recommendations for best ways to be able to identify the migration data in the target environment. For example, with CCD imports, one of the aspects of that process is we need to identify the source of the data in the DXO record. That's something that the technical resources on the project will put in place for us, and then basically when viewing the CCD report in the target environment, it's very easy to see where the imported data came from. So actually that naming convention of the source is very important to consider, because that's what people will be referencing. So that's one idea, very common. And then sometimes we make recommendations such as using or building items specific to the data migration that will help end users be able to determine that the data they're looking at is from an outside source. For example, we might suggest the client use or build a conversion or migration encounter. So notes and results coming over would be associated to an encounter very specific to the migration, make it very easy to see. Another suggestion, very similar, building a conversion or migration provider. So again, documents or notes coming from the source environment would be very easy to see that they came from a migration. So a few ideas like that. I don't know, Jason, if you have anything to add to that answer.
Well, I was going to say something about the migration provider, but I think you summed it up pretty well. So I guess we'll go ahead and move on to the next one here. So that question looks like it says, what are some of the ways to clean up our data during the migration? So I guess I can take a first pass at that one, Elise, and if you got anything you want to add, feel free.
Yeah.
So I think, with any migration, we're simply taking the data from one system and placing it into another. But there's some things we can do to clean that up in the beginning of the process. So that kind of falls on the client a little bit as far as identifying during the scoping process things that are valuable for you to move forward, and then kind of deciding things that aren't that you don't want to bring over. So things like certain scans and notes, kind of like what we talked about earlier in the presentation, saying if there's certain scans out there that maybe you're looking at IDs, old insurance cards, stuff like that, identifying that kind of stuff, saying we don't want to bring that over. Also putting some time limits around things. So if you've got labs that you may say, a lot of times we see people that go back maybe two to 3 years with labs, and then they exclude stuff before that date. So those are some ways that you can kind of clean that stuff up. And then also, just looking at your problem list, stuff like that. You can also do some cleanup before you actually migrate the data, just to kind of get that new target system cleaned up and ready to go, so you don't have a lot of clutter when you complete the migration.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jason. Actually, I have a really good example that I'm working through right now on a data migration. We have a source environment that has a very messy problem list. The intention is to bring over the active problems only. Yet in the source system, problems are all kind of mixed together: acute, chronic, even some past medical history. So one thing the client's going to do is to run a script. They've identified a certain population of problems that they want to exclude from the migration, and as Jason has suggested, the cleanup taking place in the source environment is preferable, but we can definitely address some things through the migration also. Anyway, the script would clean up the source system before we do the migration, and then, as Jason has pointed out, some of it we'll handle by just excluding data. Always important to keep in mind is, how much data do you really need to have that end users need to see in the EHR versus what can be archived. That can really drive some of the decisions around how much data, how many years worth, and that kind of thing. I think that's kind of the sum of what I wanted to add there. Jason, do you have anything else?
No, I think that sounds good. I think it looks like we're kind of running out of time here. So again, like I stated earlier, any questions that we missed today, obviously we'll take a look at those and post answers to those on our wiki page, again, galenhealthcare.com, where you can find that. So I want to thank everybody for joining us and hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.